The sun was beginning to set, casting a soft glow over the empty highway. The car hummed along the road, the only sound being the gentle thrum of the tires on the asphalt. Inside, the FBI director sat back, relaxed after a long day of meetings and strategy sessions. He had been working hard lately, managing multiple crises, but today felt different. There was a sense of calm in the air as he made his way home. It had been a productive day, and he was looking forward to some quiet time. The director had always been a busy man, surrounded by tension and urgency, but tonight he was alone with his thoughts. He glanced out the window at the fading light and couldn't help but feel a brief moment of peace. He could almost forget the weight of his position, the constant pressure, and the endless decisions he had to make every day. But as he drove, a flash of red and blue lights appeared in his rearview mirror. The sudden brightness cut through the calm, snapping him back into the reality of his day-to-day life. He didn't think much of it at first. After all, he was just one of many people on the road, and the lights could have been for anyone. He had been pulled over before, and it wasn't something that would cause him any real concern. Maybe there had been a traffic violation, or perhaps the officers were just checking on a random car. It wasn't unusual. Still, the flashing lights continued, growing brighter as they closed the distance between him and the patrol car behind. He felt a slight knot tighten in his stomach, an instinctive reaction to the unfamiliarity of the situation. It was hard to explain why, but something about this felt off. His hand instinctively moved toward the dashboard, where he knew his identification was. He wasn't worried, but his training kicked in. It was a reflex, something ingrained in him after years of dealing with the unpredictable nature of law enforcement and criminal activity. He signaled and slowly pulled his car to the side of the road, keeping his hands visible on the wheel as he had been taught. The patrol car followed closely behind, its lights flashing as the officer parked behind his vehicle. The director took a deep breath, waiting for the inevitable. As he sat there, the minutes felt like hours, and he couldn't help but wonder why it was taking so long for the officers to approach. Usually they're quick to come up to the window, but this time the officers remained in their car, almost as though they were waiting for something. After what seemed like an eternity, one of the officers finally got out of the car, his movements slow and deliberate. The director couldn't see his face clearly, but he could tell that the officer was serious. He watched as the officer made his way toward the car, his hand resting near his weapon. The director knew that this wasn't a routine stop. Something wasn't right. The officer approached the car, but instead of the usual greeting, the first words out of his mouth were sharp and commanding. "Step out of the vehicle, now." The director's heart skipped a beat. This was unexpected. He wasn't sure if it was the tone of the officer's voice or the way he was standing, but something in the way the officer spoke sent a chill down his spine. The director had dealt with all kinds of people throughout his career, but being pulled over in this way, with the officer so clearly on edge, was unsettling. He remained calm, his voice steady as he responded, "I'm the FBI director. I'm not a threat." He reached for his identification, intending to show the officer who he was and resolve the situation quickly. But before he could even finish his sentence, the officer's hand was on his gun. The director froze. This was not how he expected the situation to unfold. He wasn't sure what was going on, but it felt like the situation was escalating faster than he could process. The officer's hand didn't move from the weapon, and his body language was tense. The director knew that being an FBI agent didn't automatically protect him from this sort of treatment, but he still couldn't understand why this officer wasn't taking his word at face value. Was it a misunderstanding? Or was there something else going on? He slowly opened the door, keeping his movements calm and deliberate, just as his training had taught him. As he stepped out of the car, the officer moved quickly to place him in handcuffs. The director raised his hands, trying to show that he wasn't a threat, but the officer was too focused on the situation to pay attention to his words. For a brief moment, the director considered revealing his full identity, his position, his authority, everything that would explain why he shouldn't be treated this way. But there was something about the situation that told him to wait. He had been in high-pressure situations before, but this was different. The officer was scared, and fear could make people do unpredictable things. The officer's partner got out of the patrol car as well, but instead of assisting, he just stood there, watching. It was clear from his body language that he wasn't sure what to do either. The director could feel the tension in the air as he was forced to kneel on the side of the road, his hands cuffed behind his back. The harshness of the officer's treatment was jarring, and for a moment he couldn't believe what was happening. The director, despite the circumstances, remained calm. He understood that panic could make things worse. He tried to make eye contact with the officers, hoping they would see that he wasn't a danger. "I'm with the FBI," he repeated, his voice firm yet controlled. "You're making a mistake." But the officers didn't seem to hear him. They were too busy looking around, trying to figure out what to do next. The situation had quickly spiraled out of their control, and they were caught in a moment of panic. They hadn't anticipated someone like him, a high-ranking law enforcement official, being the one they had pulled over. The director's mind raced. How had things gotten so out of hand? He had no idea what had triggered the officer's aggressive response, but it was clear that there had been a massive misunderstanding. He tried to recall any details that might explain why the officers had acted this way. Maybe it was a miscommunication. Maybe they had received the wrong information. But none of that seemed to matter now. What mattered was that he was in a vulnerable position, kneeling on the side of the road with guns drawn, and he had no idea how this would end. The moment stretched on, the tension between the officers and the director growing thicker. The officers still hadn't realized who they had stopped. They hadn't even processed that they were dealing with someone from their own ranks, someone who had the authority to end the situation in an instant. But for now, all they saw was a man who didn't look like anyone important, just another driver they had pulled over. As the minutes ticked by, the director's thoughts raced. The world around him seemed to shrink as he tried to make sense of the situation. He couldn't let his guard down. He couldn't make any sudden moves. In the back of his mind, he hoped that the officers would soon realize their mistake. But until that happened, he would have to stay alert and patient. He could only hope that the truth would come to light before things went any further. But as the minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity, the director couldn't shake the feeling that something much bigger was at play. Minutes passed, but to the director, they felt like hours. The officers stood over him, hands gripping their weapons, their bodies stiff with uncertainty. Despite the fact that the director had told them who he was, there seemed to be no sign of recognition from the officers. They were still tense, still unsure. They had no idea who they were dealing with, and in their minds, this was just another high-stress encounter that could go wrong at any moment. The director remained calm, though inside, a storm of frustration and disbelief was brewing. He could feel the cold metal of the handcuffs digging into his wrists, but he didn't move. He knew that if he made any sudden movements, the situation could escalate. He had seen it happen before, where something as simple as an officer misinterpreting a gesture could lead to disaster. So he remained still, speaking as calmly as he could. "I am the director of the FBI," he said again, his voice steady but firm. "I'm not a criminal. You're making a huge mistake." There was still no response, not even a flicker of understanding in the officer's eyes. The younger officer, the one who had initially drawn his weapon, was pacing back and forth now, his hand still hovering near his gun. The director could see the fear in his eyes, and he understood. This was a high-stress situation for the officer, too. But the director also knew that the officer's fear was clouding his judgment. The senior officer, still standing to the side, hadn't moved much. He seemed to be processing the situation more slowly. He wasn't speaking much, only occasionally glancing at his partner and then back at the director. The tension between the three of them hung in the air like a thick fog, and it was hard to tell where things were going. Every moment felt like it could spiral out of control. The director shifted slightly in his position, trying to ease some of the tension in his own body. The discomfort of being kneeling on the road, his hands cuffed behind him, was wearing on him, but he knew that if he gave in to the urge to move, it could make things worse. So he stayed still, his eyes fixed on the officers in front of him. He noticed that their attention wasn't fully on him, though. They were still looking around, clearly unsure of how to proceed. In the distance, the low hum of passing cars continued, and for a brief moment, the director thought about what it must be like for the people in those cars, unaware of the drama unfolding on the side of the road. He felt a strange sense of isolation. It was hard to believe that he, a man with so much power, could be in such a vulnerable situation, caught in a misunderstanding he had no control over. Finally, the younger officer spoke again, his voice shaky but trying to sound confident. "You're not supposed to be here. You're under arrest." The director could feel the weight of those words. Arrest? The officers had no idea who they were dealing with, and yet they were treating him like a common criminal. The frustration boiled inside him, but he refused to let it show. He knew how to handle high-pressure situations, how to maintain composure no matter what. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this was something entirely different. He had never felt so powerless, so misjudged. "I am telling you, I'm not a criminal," the director said again. His voice was firmer now, a little louder, but still controlled. "I am the FBI director. I'm not your suspect. Please, you need to check my ID." For the first time since the incident began, the senior officer took a step forward. His hand moved slowly to his belt where he pulled out a small radio. He spoke into it, but his words were clipped, too fast for the director to understand. It was as though the officer was trying to act normal, but even through his professional tone, the director could hear the underlying stress. The minutes stretched on, each second heavier than the last. The director could see the younger officer glance at his partner again, but this time there was something different in his eyes. There was doubt now. The officer was beginning to question his own actions, but it was clear he didn't know what to do next. It wasn't long before another patrol car arrived. This one, the director noticed, was driven by someone with more experience, someone who looked like they might have the authority to sort things out. The new officer stepped out of the car, his eyes immediately scanning the scene. He was older, with a calm demeanor that suggested he had seen his share of high-stress situations. He walked toward the group, his steps measured, his expression unreadable. The moment he arrived, he stopped just a few feet from the director and his two colleagues. He didn't immediately address the director, nor did he look at the younger officer who still seemed to be holding his breath. Instead, the senior officer looked directly at the new arrival. "We've got a situation here," the senior officer said, his voice strained. "This man says he's the FBI director, but we don't know who he is. We pulled him over and now we're not sure what to do." The new officer didn't seem surprised by the news. He simply nodded as though he had been expecting something like this to happen. Without saying another word, he took out his phone and made a quick call. The director couldn't hear the conversation, but from the new officer's body language, it was clear he was getting to the bottom of this. It wasn't long before the call ended and the officer turned his attention back to the director. "Stay calm," the new officer said, his tone authoritative but not unfriendly. "We're going to figure this out." The director nodded, relieved to finally hear someone who seemed capable of handling the situation. He had been stuck in this bizarre nightmare for what felt like forever. And now, with someone who seemed to know what they were doing on the scene, there was a glimmer of hope that this would be resolved. The new officer looked at the younger officer, who was still standing with his gun drawn. "Holster your weapon," the new officer commanded, his voice sharp and clear. The younger officer hesitated for a moment, his eyes flicking between his partner and the director. He didn't want to make the wrong move, but the new officer's authority was unquestionable. Slowly, he holstered his weapon, though his hand still trembled slightly. "Now let's figure out who we're dealing with here," the new officer said, his voice calm but firm. "I don't know what happened here, but this situation is about to get a lot clearer." The director exhaled slowly, feeling the pressure in his chest ease just a little. He wasn't out of the woods yet, but he had a sense that things were beginning to move in the right direction. For the first time since the stop, the director began to feel the smallest flicker of hope. The officers were still on edge, still unsure, but there was a shift in the air. This wasn't over, but it seemed like the situation might finally be moving towards some sort of resolution. The moment the phone call ended, the air around the director seemed to shift. There was no immediate sign of relief, but he could feel the change. The new officer, who had stepped in and taken control of the situation, stood firm, his gaze steady. The tension that had built up in the last several minutes began to ease, if only slightly. The young officer who had drawn his weapon now stood back, his posture less rigid but still uncertain. The senior officer, still silent, took a step back, allowing the new arrival to take the lead. For the first time since the stop, the director felt a small sense of reassurance. It wasn't much, but it was something. He had been trapped in a confusing, surreal situation that had spiraled out of control far too quickly. Now, with the situation being taken seriously by the new officer, there was a glimmer of hope that the nightmare would soon come to an end. The new officer took a moment to assess the situation. looking from one officer to the other, and then finally back to the director. He didn't speak right away, but there was a professionalism in his silence that made the director feel a bit more at ease. The officer finally addressed him, his tone calm but direct. "I'm sorry about this," the officer said. "We'll get this sorted out quickly. Can you please give me your identification?" The director, though still handcuffed, didn't hesitate. He nodded and slowly, deliberately reached into his coat pocket. The handcuffs dug into his wrists as he tried to pull out his wallet, but he didn't let the discomfort show. It wasn't the first time he had been in a stressful situation. His years of training had taught him to keep his emotions in check, even in moments like this when it felt like everything was spinning out of control. As he handed the officer his identification, he could see the officer's expression change. The moment his eyes scanned the ID, the officer's face softened, his posture relaxing. The officer's eyes briefly flickered to the younger officer, who seemed to have noticed the shift as well. It was clear that the identification had made a significant impact. For the first time since the incident began, the director felt the situation was moving toward resolution. The officer glanced at the identification again, clearly verifying the information, and then looked back at the director. "FBI director." The officer's voice trailed off, the realization dawning on him. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't know." The director gave a small, controlled nod, his body still tense. "I understand. But this was a mistake. A big mistake." The new officer seemed genuinely apologetic, but the director could see that the situation had shaken him. The officer's confidence had faltered. And now, as he processed the information, the weight of the error seemed to be sinking in. It wasn't just any person they had pulled over. It was someone who had the authority to investigate them, to hold them accountable for their actions. The officer glanced at the younger one again, and this time, it was clear that the mistake was on them. The younger officer, still standing awkwardly to the side, finally spoke up, his voice low and hesitant. I didn't know. I thought I saw something suspicious." The new officer's gaze hardened slightly, but his voice remained even. "You should have checked more thoroughly before drawing your weapon," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "You don't escalate a situation like that without knowing who you're dealing with." The younger officer didn't respond immediately, but his eyes dropped to the ground. He clearly understood the gravity of his actions now, but it was too late to take it back. The director, still kneeling on the road with his hands bound, could feel the weight of the moment. The officer was just doing his job, albeit poorly, and the mistake had been made. But it was a mistake that couldn't easily be forgiven. As the silence stretched on, the new officer made a quick decision. He turned to the senior officer, who had been standing off to the side, watching the interaction with a careful eye. Without a word, the senior officer walked over to the patrol car, speaking into his radio. He must have been contacting their dispatcher, verifying the director's identity and ensuring that everything was in order. The director, though frustrated, had resigned himself to waiting. There was nothing more he could do at this point. His reputation, his position, everything that defined him in his professional life, had meant nothing in this moment. He had been treated like a common criminal, and the reality of that hit harder than he had expected. He was used to being in control, to being the one calling the shots, but in this moment he was powerless. As the minutes passed, the situation began to calm. The younger officer, after his brief interaction with the senior officer, stepped forward and began undoing the handcuffs. His hands shook slightly as he worked, and the director could see the guilt written all over his face. The director's wrists were sore from being bound for so long, but he didn't show it. He simply watched as the younger officer finally released him from the cuffs. The director stood slowly, rubbing his wrists as the younger officer took a step back, still avoiding eye contact. He wasn't angry with the officer. There was no point in being angry. It wouldn't solve anything. The director was well aware of how easily fear could drive people to make poor decisions. The young officer had acted out of instinct, driven by the belief that he was protecting himself and the public. But in doing so, he had failed to properly assess the situation. And now, the consequences of that mistake were becoming clear. The new officer, still standing nearby, gave a brief nod to the director. "I'll make sure everything is cleared up. I'm sorry for the inconvenience." The director nodded in return, his tone quiet but resolute. "I appreciate it." There was a long pause as the two officers exchanged a few words, and the director could hear the faint sound of radios crackling in the background. He was still processing everything that had happened, the misunderstanding, the tense moments when he had been held at gunpoint, and the strange feeling of being completely powerless. But now, with the situation beginning to diffuse, he could feel his composure returning. It was a part of who he was, a skill he had spent years developing. He knew how to keep calm, no matter the situation. After a few more minutes, the senior officer returned to the scene. He nodded to the director and then to the other officers. Everything checks out. It was a mistake, plain and simple. The director exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing just a bit. I understand. But this should never happen again. The officers all nodded in agreement, and the director, despite everything, knew that the situation was winding down. He had been caught in a situation where his identity and authority meant nothing in the eyes of the officers who had made a mistake, but he also knew that this incident would serve as a lesson for everyone involved. As he turned to leave, he glanced back at the officers. They were still standing, still uncertain about the next steps, but at least now there was no more fear in the air. The situation had been resolved, but the director couldn't help but feel a lingering discomfort. He would walk away from this, but the officers would have to live with their actions, and for them, that would be the real test. The director sat in his car, the engine running, the sound of the world outside faint compared to the chaos he had just experienced. He couldn't shake the images of the officers standing over him, guns drawn, the tension hanging in the air like a thick fog. He had spent so much of his career managing crises, solving problems, making decisions that affected entire communities. But this was different. It was personal. For the first time, he had felt utterly powerless. He gripped the steering wheel, feeling the weight of the day settling in. The officers had apologized, of course, but the damage had already been done. They hadn't recognized him right away. They hadn't treated him with respect or even basic consideration. And that was the part he couldn't get past. He was the head of the FBI. He wasn't used to being looked at with fear, suspicion, or confusion, and yet that was how he had been treated. He had been just another face, another potential criminal in the eyes of those officers. He had told them who he was. He had remained calm, patient, even though everything in him wanted to demand better treatment. But they hadn't listened right away. It took time for them to realize their mistake, and even then, their apology had been more out of obligation than genuine understanding. The younger officer still couldn't look him in the eye. The older officer was more professional, but even he seemed rattled by the mistake. It was clear that no one had truly grasped the weight of the situation. It was a feeling that stuck with him as he drove home. The drive was long, and the quiet of the road only made him think more. He had been through difficult situations before many times over, but this was different. He had always been the one in charge, the one making the tough decisions. But today he had been the one who had been vulnerable. He had been the one who had been misunderstood. As he approached his home, he couldn't help but replay the events over and over in his mind. He knew it wasn't just about him. It wasn't about his pride or his reputation. It was about something much larger. If this could happen to him, someone who held so much authority, then what about the average citizen? What about the people who didn't have the ability to quickly clarify who they were, the people who didn't have the resources to get things cleared up right away? He parked his car in the driveway, turning off the engine. He sat there for a few moments, staring at the front door of his home. Inside, everything was quiet. His family would be there waiting for him. He should go inside, he knew that. He should shake off the tension of the day, forget about the mistake, and move on. But something told him that this wouldn't be easy to shake. This wasn't just about a simple mistake, it was about the system. The way things were done, the way people were treated based on assumptions, based on what they looked like or how they sounded. He took a deep breath and opened the car door, stepping out into the cool evening air. As he walked up the steps to his front door, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He paused for a moment, pulling it out. It was a text from his colleague at the FBI, a message simply saying, "We're going to need to look into this." He didn't need to ask what this meant. It was about the incident. He had already known that something like this wouldn't be easily forgotten. As he entered the house, he was greeted by his family. His children, excited to see him, ran over and gave him a quick hug, asking about his day. His wife smiled, but there was something in her eyes. a quiet concern that she wasn't voicing. She always seemed to sense when something was bothering him, even when he didn't want to talk about it. "How was your day?" she asked, a gentle question, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. He smiled, trying to keep things light. "Long," he said, ruffling his son's hair. "But I'm glad to be home." He could see that she didn't buy the casual tone, but she didn't press him. Instead, she gave him space, letting him unwind. They had dinner together, the conversation flowing naturally as they talked about everything except the incident. It felt good to be with his family, to be surrounded by normalcy, but even as they laughed and shared stories, a part of him was still caught in the events of the day. Later, after dinner, the director went to his study. He sat down at his desk, staring at the papers in front of him, but his mind kept drifting back to the traffic stop. The mistake, the officer's fear, the tension. It felt like the world had shifted in a way that he hadn't expected. He had always known that law enforcement officers were under pressure, that their jobs could be dangerous, but today, he had seen the consequences of fear and miscommunication up close. He had seen how easily the line between law and disorder could be blurred. He was used to controlling the narrative, shaping the story. But today, the story had controlled him. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from one of his higher-ups at the FBI. He answered quickly, already knowing what the conversation would be about. "I heard about the incident," the voice on the other end of the line said. "We need to discuss what happened and what steps to take next." The director nodded, rubbing his temples as he tried to steady his thoughts. It was a mistake, a big one. But the real issue here isn't just what happened. It's the lack of proper training. This officer, the younger one, reacted out of fear. He didn't know who I was, and he didn't take the time to figure it out. "I agree," the voice on the phone responded. "But we need to make sure this doesn't turn into a public relations nightmare. We need to address it internally, and make sure that every officer is trained to properly assess a situation. If this happened to you, imagine what it could do to a regular citizen." "That's exactly what I'm thinking," the director replied. "We need to reassess how officers are trained, not just in handling high-stress situations, but in dealing with their own biases. Fear can cloud judgment, and when that happens, things like this occur." There was a pause on the other end of the line before the voice responded. "Agreed. We'll start an internal review, but you'll need to be prepared for the fallout. People will want answers." "I'm already prepared," the director said, though he didn't fully believe it. "Let's just make sure we don't make the same mistake again." The conversation ended shortly after that, but the director couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The incident had exposed a crack in the system, one that could no longer be ignored. He knew that there would be more questions, more scrutiny, and the weight of the situation would only grow heavier as the days went on. The director sat back in his chair, staring out the window into the darkening sky. He had always believed in the system, in law enforcement, in the power of doing things by the book. But today, the cracks had become visible, and now it was up to him to help fix them. But for now, all he could do was wait. Wait for the investigation, wait for the consequences, and wait for the moment when the system would have to reckon with the truth. The days following the incident were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and endless discussions about what had gone wrong. The director had anticipated that things wouldn't be simple, but the fallout was even more complicated than he had imagined. News of the traffic stop had made its way to the media, and while the coverage was largely focused on the mistake itself, the implications were far-reaching. Questions about police training, biases, and the way law enforcement officials interacted with the public flooded every news outlet. The incident had turned into a case study, one that was both embarrassing and deeply troubling for everyone involved. Internally, the FBI had already begun its investigation. The director had given a detailed account of the events, but even he knew that his perspective was just one piece of the puzzle. He had spent years navigating the complexities of law enforcement, but nothing could have prepared him for the rawness of what had unfolded. He was still processing it all. The fear, the confusion, the lack of control. It was something he hadn't experienced before, at least not on a personal level. The young officer involved in the incident had been placed on administrative leave while the department conducted its investigation. The director didn't want to see the officer punished, but he knew that this couldn't be swept under the rug. The situation had shown a lack of judgment, a failure to properly assess the situation, and it had exposed a crack in the system that needed to be addressed. The director had made it clear to his superiors that the issue wasn't just about one officer's mistake, it was about a systemic problem. Law enforcement officers were trained to handle high-pressure situations, but the training often overlooked the human side of policing. Fear, bias, and assumption could cloud a person's judgment in a split second. The director had seen it before in various forms, but seeing it firsthand had given him a new perspective. And it wasn't just about the officers. It was also about how the public saw the police, how people felt when they encountered law enforcement, and how quickly trust could be shattered. As the director sat in his office one afternoon, reviewing reports and emails, there was a knock on the door. It was his colleague, a seasoned investigator who had been assigned to help with the internal review. She stepped into the room, her expression serious but respectful. "Mind if we talk for a minute?" she asked, taking a seat across from him. "Of course," he said, setting aside the documents he had been reading. "What's on your mind?" She paused, gathering her thoughts before speaking. "I've gone through the footage from the traffic stop, the body cam footage from the officers. It's clear that there was a serious lack of communication and proper procedure. But what struck me the most was the way the situation escalated so quickly. The fear was palpable." The director nodded, his gaze distant. "I felt that fear. It's not easy to describe, but I could see how quickly it can take over, even for the most trained officers." She nodded. "Exactly. And that's where the real problem lies. We're all taught how to handle high-stress situations, but how many of us are actually trained to manage fear in those moments? Or to deal with the unconscious biases that might kick in when we feel threatened?" The director leaned forward, his hands clasped together on the desk. "It's not just about handling fear, it's about understanding it. Most officers are taught to react to a perceived threat, but they don't always stop to question why they feel threatened in the first place. That's something we need to address at a fundamental level." She nodded again, agreeing with his assessment. "We're looking at more than just a simple error in judgment here. We're looking at a larger issue with how we prepare our officers for real-world situations. It's not enough to just teach them to handle stress. We need to teach them to understand their emotions, their biases, and the way those things can affect their decisions." The director leaned back in his chair, his eyes focused on the wall in front of him as he thought about what she had said. He knew that changing the system wasn't going to be easy. It was a monumental task. But something had to change. The incident had shown him just how quickly things could go wrong, how easily a situation could spiral out of control. It had also reminded him that at the end of the day, law enforcement was about people. It was about how officers interacted with the public, how they understood their role, and how they maintained trust in their communities. He sighed, looking up at her. "We're not just dealing with an officer's mistake. We're dealing with the entire system. And it's going to take a lot more than just a few reforms to fix it. We need to completely rethink how we train officers, how we approach law enforcement, and how we build trust." She met his gaze, her expression serious but determined. "I agree. And I think the first step is starting the conversation. We need to have an open dialogue about what happened, about the mistakes that were made, and about what needs to change moving forward." The director nodded. "It's not going to be easy, but it's necessary." They sat in silence for a moment, both deep in thought. The director knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he also knew that it was a road that needed to be traveled. The mistake that had been made during the traffic stop couldn't be undone, but it could serve as a catalyst for change. If they could learn from it, if they could use it as an opportunity to improve, then perhaps something good could come out of the chaos. Later that day, the director received another call from the senior officer involved in the incident. The officer was apologetic, but there was something more in his tone this time, something that indicated he was beginning to understand the gravity of the situation. He had been part of the department's internal review, and he had acknowledged the flaws in the way the situation had been handled. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," the officer said, "and I realize now that this wasn't just a mistake. It was a failure. A failure on my part and on all of ours. We didn't do what we were supposed to do. We didn't take the time to properly assess the situation. We acted out of fear, and that's not how we should be doing our jobs." The director listened quietly, hearing the sincerity in the officer's voice. "I appreciate you acknowledging that. But this isn't about placing blame. It's about understanding what went wrong and how we can fix it." This is about making sure something like this doesn't happen again. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I know, and I want to help make that happen. I want to be part of the solution. The director nodded, even though the officer couldn't see him. Then let's work together to make that change. We can't undo what happened, but we can make sure it doesn't define who we are or how we do our jobs. As the call ended, the director sat back in his chair, reflecting on the conversation. For the first time since the incident, he felt a sense of hope. Maybe this was the beginning of something. Maybe, just maybe, this moment of chaos could lead to something better. The following weeks were filled with discussions, training sessions, and policy reviews. The director worked closely with law enforcement experts, psychologists, and community leaders to build a new training curriculum, one that would address fear, bias, and decision-making under pressure. It was a long and arduous process, but the director was committed to seeing it through. He knew that real change wouldn't come easily, but he also knew that it was worth the fight. Months later, the director stood in front of a crowd of law enforcement officers, community leaders, and the press. He spoke about the changes that had been made, the lessons learned, and the importance of rebuilding trust. The road ahead was still long, but the first steps had been taken, and for the director, that was enough. The system had been tested, and though it had faltered, it had also found a way to rise again. The director had been part of that journey, and he was determined to make sure it was a journey that would change law enforcement for the better. The months that followed were some of the most challenging the director had ever faced. The changes he had set into motion, rethinking the way law enforcement was trained, focusing on empathy, bias awareness, and emotional intelligence, were met with both praise and resistance. The conversation he had started was one that had been long overdue. But not everyone was ready to listen. There were officers who welcomed the change, eager to embrace new ways of thinking, to challenge old habits and perceptions that had been ingrained in them for years. These were the officers who understood that the job wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about connecting with people, understanding them, and responding to their needs, not just their actions. For them, the new training was a breath of fresh air. It was a reminder that they weren't just enforcers of the law, but protectors of the community. But not everyone saw it that way. Some officers felt threatened by the new direction. They were used to the old way, where authority was absolute and unquestioned. For them, the new approach felt like a betrayal of everything they had been taught. They didn't understand why empathy and understanding were being prioritized over traditional law enforcement methods. They believed that it was a dangerous shift that would compromise their safety and the safety of the public. It wasn't easy for the director to navigate these opposing views. He understood the fears and concerns of those who resisted change. They had spent their careers in a system that rewarded strength and decisiveness, not vulnerability or introspection. For them, the notion that fear and bias could cloud their judgment was unsettling. They didn't want to believe it because acknowledging it meant admitting that the system they had served under for so long might have been flawed. But the director knew that they couldn't ignore it any longer. The incident with the traffic stop had shown just how quickly things could escalate. It had been a wake-up call for everyone, officers and civilians alike. The public had also started demanding answers. They had seen the footage. They had heard the story. And they wanted change. They wanted a system that not only held officers accountable, but also one that acknowledged the humanity of those officers, their fears, their biases, their emotions. The director had made it clear from the beginning that this wasn't about blaming anyone. It wasn't about pointing fingers or assigning guilt. It was about learning from mistakes, understanding where the system had failed, and working together to make things better. And slowly, piece by piece, the system began to shift. The first few months had been full of meetings and training sessions, sometimes contentious, sometimes hopeful. The director spent countless hours with experts in psychology, sociology, and law enforcement, trying to bridge the gap between theory and practice. He worked directly with officers on the ground, listening to their concerns, their frustrations, and their ideas. He knew that real change had to come from within, and that meant engaging with the people who would be affected most by the new training. One day, after a particularly long training session, the director found himself standing outside, alone, staring up at the sky. The weight of the past months hung heavy on his shoulders, but there was a sense of accomplishment, too. Things were moving forward. He had seen the progress firsthand. Officers who had once been skeptical of the new approach were beginning to speak out in favor of it. They were starting to see the value in understanding themselves better, in learning how to handle not just the law but the human side of their jobs. But there was still so much work to be done. The public's perception of the police had been shaken, and it wasn't something that could be repaired overnight. Trust had to be rebuilt, brick by brick. And the director knew that the success of the changes he had introduced would depend on how well the system responded to the next crisis. There would be another moment, another incident that would test everything they had worked for. He couldn't let that moment slip by. As he walked back to his office, his phone buzzed with a new message. It was from his colleague, the one who had been part of the internal review after the traffic stop incident. The message was short but direct. "There's been another situation. We need to talk." The director's stomach tightened. He had feared this moment. Change was hard, and with change came resistance, missteps, and setbacks. It was inevitable. But the question now was how they would handle this next situation. Would it be another failure? Or would they finally prove that the new approach had teeth, that it could stand up in the face of adversity? He quickly made his way to the conference room, where the team had already gathered. His colleague was waiting for him, her expression grim. "What's going on?" he asked, sitting down at the table. She looked at him for a moment before speaking. "There's been a case of excessive force. The officers involved were part of the new training program." The director's heart sank. This was the moment he had feared. He had known that not everyone would embrace the changes, but he hadn't expected it to come so soon, so publicly. He had believed that the new approach would take root, that it would slowly spread throughout the department. But now, just when they were starting to see the benefits, they were faced with a failure that could undo everything. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "Tell me everything." His colleague proceeded to lay out the details. A situation had escalated in a neighborhood that had been struggling with gang violence. The officers involved had responded with what they thought was appropriate force, but the public perception was entirely different. Bystanders had filmed the encounter, and the footage had gone viral within hours. It showed the officers using force on a suspect who appeared to be unarmed, and the community was outraged. The director listened carefully, taking in every detail. This wasn't just about the officers involved. This was about the public's trust. It was about how quickly everything could unravel. The new training had been intended to address exactly this kind of situation, but now it seemed that the officers had misinterpreted the principles they had been taught. "We can't let this slip," the director said, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "We have to act fast. We can't afford to let one bad incident undo all the work we've done." The room fell silent as everyone turned their attention to him. The weight of the responsibility was clear, but the director knew that this was the moment of truth. They had to show that the new training wasn't just about the theory. It had to be about the practice. They had to prove that real change could happen, even in the toughest situations. "We need to investigate," the director said, his tone firm. "But more than that, we need to show the community that we are committed to learning from this. We can't just sweep it under the rug. We have to own our mistakes." His colleagues nodded in agreement. They knew that the director was right. This was not just a challenge. It was an opportunity to prove that they could do better, that the system could evolve, and that change could take root even in the face of resistance. As the meeting concluded, the director walked out into the hallway, his mind racing with possibilities. He had worked so hard to get to this point, to change the culture of law enforcement, to make it about understanding, not just enforcing. He had started something that had the potential to transform everything. But now, he had to prove that it was more than just words. He had to prove that it could withstand the pressure of the real world. The path ahead wasn't easy, but the director knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to give up. This fight was worth it. And no matter how many setbacks there were, no matter how many obstacles they faced, he would continue to push forward, because true change didn't happen without struggle. And as long as he had the strength to keep going, he would. It wasn't just about fixing the mistakes of the past. It was about creating a future where trust, understanding, and empathy were the foundation of law enforcement. And that was something worth fighting for.